When they called her name, the woman who walked through those courtroom doors wasn't just another witness. She was a nuclear bomb with a court-issued subpoena, and I watched my wife's face drain of every drop of color as she recognized her. Welcome to Cheating Story Exposed. Real stories, real justice, no sugarcoating. You know what? I notice many of you watching haven't hit that subscribe button yet. Here's the thing, we drop stories like this every single day. Stories about people who got played, got smart, and got even. If you want to see how these situations really end, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. My name is Nathan Caldwell, and 6 months ago I thought I had the perfect marriage. I'm a structural engineer, 42 years old, and I'd been married to my wife Veronica for 14 years. We had 2 kids, Mia, 12, and Connor, 9. I worked hard, provided well, and genuinely believed we were building something lasting. Turns out I was the only one building. She was busy tearing everything down while I had my back turned. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening in March. I came home from a site inspection around 7, covered in concrete dust, and found Veronica in our home office with the door closed. Nothing unusual. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and often took calls at night. But when I knocked to let her know I was home, she ended the call so abruptly I heard her phone hit the desk. When she opened the door, her face had that tight, forced smile people wear when they've just been caught doing something they shouldn't. I didn't think much of it that night. Maybe I should have. The second crack came 2 weeks later when I noticed she'd changed her phone passcode. We'd always had an open phone policy, not because we didn't trust each other, but because we had nothing to hide. Or so I thought. When I asked her about it casually while we were getting ready for bed, she said her company had implemented new security protocols for their sales team. It sounded reasonable. Pharmaceutical companies are paranoid about data breaches. The third crack shattered everything. I was home with Connor one Saturday afternoon while Veronica took Mia to a supposed regional sales conference in Richmond. Connor had been running a fever all morning, so I'd canceled my plans to review blueprints and was playing video games with him in the living room when Mia's iPad chimed with a notification. She'd left it charging on the kitchen counter. The notification preview showed a message from Veronica. Room 427, he won't be back until 6. Miss you already. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might be sick. Connor was calling my name, asking if I was okay, and I had to force myself to smile and tell him I just remembered I forgot to send an email. I picked up the iPad with hands that had started shaking. Mia and Veronica shared an iCloud account for family coordination, which meant their messages synced. I opened the thread, 6 months of messages loaded. 6 months of I love yous and I can't wait to see you and explicit descriptions of what they'd done and planned to do. The man's name was Bradley Whitmore. He was, according to their conversations, a hospital administrator at Richmond Medical Center. Married, 2 kids, and apparently very, very involved with my wife. I sat on our kitchen floor with that iPad for 2 hours while Connor played his game in the other room, occasionally calling out to ask if I was coming back. I read every message. I looked at every photo she'd sent him. I watched my marriage dissolve into pixels and lies, and something inside me went very, very cold. I didn't confront her that night when she came home glowing and relaxed, talking about the productive sessions at her conference. I didn't confront her the next morning when she made pancakes for the kids while humming. I didn't say a word for 3 weeks while I methodically documented everything, hired a private investigator named Marcus Reed who specialized in infidelity cases, and consulted with 3 different divorce attorneys before settling on Patricia Donnelly, a woman with a reputation for eating opposing counsel alive. Marcus was worth every penny. Within 2 weeks, he'd confirmed that Bradley Whitmore was indeed married to a woman named Jennifer, that they had 3 children aged 8, 6, and 3, and that Bradley had been having affairs with at least 2 other women over the past 4 years. He got me photos, timestamps, hotel receipts that Veronica had stupidly put on our joint credit card disguised as client dinners, and most damning of all, a recording of Veronica and Bradley in his car discussing how to handle their respective divorces. They were planning it, both of them. They'd agreed to wait until after Bradley's youngest started kindergarten to avoid complicated custody arrangements, but they were mapping out their future together while I tucked my kids into bed and kissed a woman who'd already left our marriage in everything but paperwork. Patricia advised me to be patient. Document everything. Show nothing. Act normal, so I did. I went to work, came home, had dinner with my family, made love to my wife when she initiated, helped Connor with his math homework, and drove Mia to soccer practice. And the entire time, I was building a case that would protect my children and ensure Veronica's betrayal came with real consequences. The divorce papers were filed on a Thursday morning in June. I had Veronica served at her office, which I know sounds cruel, but Patricia insisted it was important to establish that I was taking the moral and legal high ground. The process server reported that Veronica had remained composed, thanked him professionally, and immediately called someone on her phone. That someone was undoubtedly her attorney, because by Friday afternoon, I received notice that she'd retained Gerald. Hutchins, a divorce lawyer known for two things: winning custody battles and destroying fathers' reputations in court. The war had officially begun. What I didn't expect was how dirty Veronica would fight. My wife, the woman who'd cried during sad commercials and volunteered at our kids' school, turned into someone I didn't recognize. Her first move was filing for a restraining order claiming I'd been emotionally abusive throughout our marriage, and she feared for her safety. It was denied because she couldn't provide any evidence, but the accusation itself was enough to plant seeds of doubt. Her second move was telling Mia and Connor that Daddy was very angry right now and had decided he didn't want to be married anymore, which wasn't fair because Mommy still loved him very much. I found out about this when Mia asked me, in tears, why I was breaking up our family. That night, after I explained to both kids that sometimes grown-ups can't stay married even though they both love their children very much, I called Patricia and told her I wanted custody. Her third move was the most calculated. She began building a narrative that I was mentally unstable, obsessive, and potentially dangerous. She collected evidence that I'd been monitoring her movements, which I had through the pie, but she framed it as stalking. She claimed I'd been making increasingly paranoid accusations about her having an affair, which I had, because she was having one. She even got her mother to sign an affidavit saying I'd always had anger issues that worried the family. It was masterful character assassination, and it was working. By the time we had our first custody hearing in August, Hutchins had successfully painted me as a controlling, paranoid husband who'd driven his wife away with baseless accusations, and was now trying to take the children out of spite. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Holloway, listened to all of this with an expression that gave nothing. Away, she ordered a custody evaluation, which meant we'd each be interviewed by a court-appointed psychologist who would then make a recommendation about custody arrangements. The evaluator, Dr. Richard Pemberton, spent 2 hours with me in September. He asked about my childhood, my marriage, my relationship with my children, my work schedule, and my allegations about Veronica's affair. I answered every question honestly and provided him with every piece of evidence Marcus had collected. He remained professionally neutral, thanked me for my time, and said he'd be speaking with Veronica, the children, and several character witnesses before making his recommendation. I waited 6 weeks for that report. 6 weeks of having my kids only on Wednesday evenings and every other weekend, while Veronica got to play the primary parent and continue poisoning them against me with carefully worded comments about how sad it was that Daddy was being so difficult. When Dr. Pemberton's report finally arrived, it was 23 pages long and utterly devastating. He'd concluded that while I was a capable and loving father, my obsessive focus on Veronica's alleged affair and my invasive surveillance of her activities suggested control issues that could be detrimental to the children's emotional well-being. He recommended primary custody remain with Veronica, with me receiving standard visitation. I read that report 3 times in Patricia's office, my hands shaking with rage. He'd interviewed Veronica's mother, her sister, her best friend from college, and her boss, all of whom apparently testified to my increasingly erratic behavior over the past year. None of them mentioned that I'd been working longer hours because we were building an extension on the house that Veronica had insisted we needed. None of them mentioned that I'd been stressed because my company was bidding on its largest contract ever. None of them mentioned that every erratic behavior they cited happened. After I discovered my wife was having an affair, Patricia set the report down and looked at me with the expression of someone about to deliver more bad news. The custody hearing was scheduled for October 15th. Hutchins would use this report as the foundation of his case. And then she told me what else she'd learned through her own investigation. Veronica was planning to bring 6 witnesses to testify to my unfitness as a father. 6 people who would stand in front of Judge Holloway and systematically destroy my character. Her mother, her sister, her boss, a neighbor I'd had a property line dispute with 2 years ago, the father of one of Connor's classmates who I'd confronted about his son bullying Connor, and Dr. Pemberton himself, who would be called to explain his findings in detail. I sat in Patricia's office for a long time after she finished explaining all of this. I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since finding those messages on Mia's iPad. Despair. They were going to win. Veronica and her attorney had built a case so comprehensive, so seemingly credible, that Judge Holloway would have no choice but to rule in her favor. I would become a part-time parent, watching from the sidelines as my children were raised by a woman who'd proven herself capable of sustained, calculated deception. Patricia let me sit there for about 5 minutes before she leaned forward and asked me a question that changed everything. "Do you know anything about Bradley Whitmore's wife?" I told her what Marcus had found out. Jennifer Whitmore, 38, stay-at-home mother, no social media presence to speak of, seemingly devoted to her children based on the photos that did exist. Patricia smiled then, a sharp, predatory smile that reminded me why I'd hired her. She asked if I'd be willing to do something that would feel ruthless, but was entirely legal and potentially devastating to Veronica's case. I asked what it was. She told me to invite Jennifer Whitmore. To testify? I'll admit I hesitated. Not because I felt sorry for Veronica, that ship had sailed 6 months ago, but because dragging another betrayed spouse into this felt cruel. Jennifer Whitmore hadn't done anything wrong. She was just as much a victim as I was, but Patricia explained something I hadn't considered. Jennifer had been living with a serial cheater for years. She likely knew or suspected something. She might even have evidence of her own that she'd been too afraid or too tired to use. And more importantly, her testimony would establish the objective truth that Veronica had been having an affair, which would completely dismantle the narrative that I was a paranoid, controlling husband making baseless accusations. I went home that night and thought about it for hours. I thought about Mia asking me why I was breaking up our family. I thought about Connor's confused face when Veronica told him Daddy was angry. I thought about the next 10 years of being a visitor in my own children's lives while Veronica and Bradley played house with them. Then I called Patricia and told her to do it. Marcus found Jennifer Whitmore's contact information within a day. Patricia drafted a carefully worded letter explaining who I was, what was happening, and inviting her to speak with us, emphasizing that she was under no obligation and would not be forced to testify if she didn't want to. We sent it via certified mail so we'd know she received it. She called Patricia's office 3 days later. The meeting took place at Patricia's office on a Wednesday afternoon. Jennifer Whitmore was smaller than I expected, maybe 5'3", with brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well in years. She wore jeans and a cardigan and carried a large purse that she clutched like a shield. She sat across from me and Patricia, looked at me for a long moment and said, "I knew about your wife. I just didn't know her name until I got your letter." My chest tightened. Patricia remained perfectly calm, legal pad ready, and asked Jennifer to tell us everything. Jennifer had known Bradley was having affairs for 4 years. She'd found hotel receipts, credit card charges, text messages he'd deleted but she'd recovered. She'd confronted him twice. Both times he'd admitted to mistakes, sworn he'd changed, begged her not to leave, and reminded her that she had no job, no family nearby, and 3 children who needed stability. He'd convinced her that staying was the right choice, the practical choice. But 3 months ago, she'd found something that changed her perspective, a document on Bradley's laptop outlining his financial plans for divorcing her. He'd already consulted with an attorney. He'd already calculated child support payments. He'd already decided that once their youngest was in school full-time, he was leaving. Jennifer had been living with that knowledge, quietly preparing her own exit strategy when my letter arrived. And suddenly, she saw an opportunity that served both of us. She could establish Bradley's pattern of infidelity in my custody case, which would help her own divorce when she finally filed. Patricia asked if Jennifer had documentation. Jennifer opened that large purse and pulled out a manila envelope containing 3 years of bank statements showing payments to hotels, restaurants, and a jewelry store that Bradley had claimed was for client relations. She had screenshots of text messages between Bradley and at least 4 different women, including one exchange where he and Veronica discussed which hotel to use because his wife had started checking up on him. Most damning of all, she had a recording from Bradley's car. He'd given her his old phone when he upgraded, not realizing that it was still connected to his car's Bluetooth system. Every conversation he had on speakerphone in that car for the past 8 months had been automatically recorded and synced to the cloud storage on that old phone. Patricia and I sat there in stunned silence as Jennifer played us a 3-minute clip of Bradley and Veronica discussing their future together. They talked about how they'd split holidays with the kids. They talked about which of their houses they'd keep. Veronica preferred ours because it had the pool Bradley thought his had better school access. They talked about how to handle their respective exes. Veronica said I was too proud to make a scene. Bradley said Jennifer was too passive to fight back. I felt something dangerous rise in my chest listening to them dismiss us like we were just inconvenient paperwork to be filed. Patricia must have seen it on my face because she reached over and put her hand on my arm, a gentle reminder to stay controlled. Jennifer turned off the recording and looked at both of us. She said she'd testify. She said she'd bring every piece of documentation she had. She said she wanted Bradley and Veronica to understand that passive people were only passive until you pushed them too far. Patricia drafted the subpoena that afternoon. Jennifer Whitmore was officially listed as a witness for the defense in my custody case. We didn't tell Hutchins who she was, just provided her name as required by court rules. Let him figure it out when she walked through the door. The custody hearing was scheduled for October 15th at 9 in the morning. I wore my best suit, the charcoal gray one I reserved for meeting with important clients, and arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early with Patricia. We sat on a bench outside Judge Holloway's courtroom and reviewed our strategy while I tried to keep my hands from shaking. Veronica arrived 15 minutes later with Hutchins and her parade of witnesses. She'd worn a pale blue dress that made her look vulnerable and sympathetic, and she'd styled her hair the way she used to for church, soft and conservative. She glanced at me once as she walked past, her expression carefully arranged into something that looked like sad resignation. I stared back with no expression at all. Judge Holloway's courtroom was exactly as cold and imposing as I remembered from our previous hearings. Dark wood high ceilings, the state seal mounted behind the judge's bench like a warning. We took our positions at our respective tables, Veronica to the right with Hutchins, me to the left with Patricia, and waited for Judge Holloway to enter. When she did, we all stood. She was wearing her standard black robe and carrying a thick file folder that I assumed contained every document from our case. She sat, told us to sit, and asked Hutchins if he was ready to proceed. He was. Over the next 2 hours, I sat quietly while 6 people took the stand and methodically tore my character apart. Veronica's mother went first. She testified that I'd always been distant with the children, that I prioritized work over family, that I'd made Veronica cry on multiple occasions with my cold demeanor. She claimed I'd never approved of her daughter's career, and had been trying to convince Veronica to quit her job and be a full-time mother, which was news to me considering I'd always supported her ambitions. Patricia cross-examined gently, asking if she'd ever witnessed me being abusive or neglectful. Veronica's mother admitted she hadn't, but insisted that emotional abuse was just as damaging. Patricia let it go. Veronica's sister was next. She told a story about a family vacation 3 years ago where I'd allegedly lost my temper over a restaurant reservation and ruined the entire evening. It had actually been her husband who'd lost his temper, but Hutchins presented it smoothly and Judge Holloway took notes. The neighbor, a man named Douglas Brennan, who I'd caught letting his dog use our front lawn as a bathroom, testified that I'd been aggressive in confronting him about the issue, and that it had made him uncomfortable having his children play near our house. Patricia got him to admit that the confrontation consisted of me asking him politely to keep his dog on his own property, then not so politely when he ignored me 3 times. But the damage was done. Veronica's boss described me as controlling based on the fact that I'd occasionally called Veronica during work hours to discuss household matters. He mentioned that Veronica had confided in him about my accusations regarding her fidelity and how it had affected her performance at work. The father of Connor's classmate recounted an incident where I'd confronted him in the school parking lot about his son pushing Connor off the playground equipment. He described me as threatening and said he'd considered calling the police. Patricia got him to admit that his son had indeed been bullying Connor and that the school had confirmed this. But again, the narrative was set. Finally, Dr. Pemberton took the stand and walked through his evaluation in professional clinical language. He talked about my obsessive fixation on the affair allegations, my surveillance behaviors, and my difficulty accepting responsibility for the marriage breakdown. He recommended once again that primary custody remain with Veronica. By the time Hutchins rested his case, it was nearly noon. Judge Holloway called a 30-minute recess for lunch. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Patricia, barely touching the sandwich she'd insisted I buy, and wondered if this was what defeat felt like. Patricia told me to stay calm. Our turn was coming. When we reconvened, Judge Holloway asked if the defense would like to call any witnesses. Patricia stood and said we had one witness to call, Jennifer Whitmore. I watched Hutchins's face. He glanced down at his notes, clearly trying to place the name, then looked at Veronica. Veronica had gone very, very pale. She leaned over to whisper something to Hutchins, who immediately stood and requested a sidebar with Judge Holloway. Judge. Holloway motioned both attorneys to approach the bench. They spoke in low voices for about 2 minutes while I sat there watching Veronica's hands clench and unclench on the table in front of her. Whatever Hutchins was arguing, Judge Holloway wasn't buying it. She sent them back to their tables and told Patricia to call her witness. The bailiff went to get Jennifer from the waiting room outside. It took maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then the door opened, and Jennifer Whitmore walked into that courtroom carrying her large purse and looking directly at Veronica. I will never forget the expression on my wife's face in that moment. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the look of someone watching a carefully built house of cards begin to collapse and knowing there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. Jennifer was sworn in and took her seat in the witness box. Patricia began with the basics: her name, her address, her relationship status. Jennifer answered in a clear, steady voice that she was married to Bradley Whitmore, that they had 3 children together, and that she'd been married for 16 years. Patricia then asked if Jennifer knew anyone else in the courtroom. Jennifer looked directly at Veronica and said, "Yes, that woman has been having an affair with my husband for approximately 9 months." Hutchins shot to his feet objecting, but Judge Holloway overruled him and told Patricia to continue. What followed was the most methodical dismantling of a false narrative I've ever witnessed. Patricia walked Jennifer through everything: how she discovered the affairs, what evidence she'd collected, and specifically what she knew about Bradley's relationship with Veronica. Then Patricia asked permission to enter evidence. Judge Holloway agreed. Patricia handed Jennifer's documentation to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge: bank statements, screenshots, hotel receipts with Veronica's signature on several of them. And finally, the recording. Judge Holloway listened to that 3-minute clip with her reading glasses on and no expression on her face. When it finished, she set her glasses down and looked at Veronica for a long, long moment. Hutchins tried to object on the grounds that the recording was obtained without consent, but Patricia calmly explained that Virginia is a one-party consent state and Jennifer, as the owner of the device that made the recording, had every legal right to it. Judge Holloway agreed. Patricia asked Jennifer a few more questions about the timeline, about Bradley's pattern of behavior, about whether she'd ever met me before our initial consultation. Jennifer answered everything precisely and without embellishment. Then Patricia asked her final question. "Mrs. Whitmore, in your opinion, based on everything you know about this situation, do you believe Nathan Caldwell's concerns about his wife's fidelity were baseless accusations born from paranoia and control issues?" Jennifer looked at me, then at Veronica, then back at Patricia. She said, "No, I believe he discovered the truth about something that was really happening and had every right to be concerned about how that would affect his children." Patricia thanked her and sat down. Hutchins stood for cross-examination, looking like a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand. He tried to establish that Jennifer was a scorned wife acting out of revenge, that her evidence could be fabricated, that she had ulterior motives for testifying. Jennifer remained calm throughout. She answered every question honestly, admitted that, yes, she was hurt by her husband's betrayal, but maintained that everything she'd provided was authentic and verifiable. When Hutchins suggested she was lying to help my case, she looked at him and said, "I have no reason to lie. The truth is damaging enough." Hutchins sat down. Judge Holloway asked if either side had anything else. Patricia said we rested our case. Hutchins requested an immediate recess to consult with his client. Judge Holloway gave them 10 minutes. I watched Veronica and Hutchins huddle in the hallway outside the courtroom, her face streaked with tears, him shaking his head and gesturing emphatically. When they came back, Veronica wouldn't look at me. Judge Holloway asked if the petitioner wished to present any rebuttal. Hutchins said they did not. Then Judge Holloway did something I didn't expect. She didn't take the matter under advisement. She didn't schedule another hearing for a ruling. She looked at both of us and said she was prepared to rule from the bench. She said she'd reviewed Dr. Pemberton's evaluation carefully and had found his methodology sound based on the information he'd been provided. However, his evaluation was fundamentally flawed because it was based on false information. Every single witness who'd testified about my allegedly controlling and paranoid behavior had failed to mention or didn't know that my concerns about my wife's fidelity were entirely justified. She said that discovering a spouse's infidelity would naturally cause any reasonable person to experience stress, anger, and yes, to take steps to document what was happening. That didn't make someone obsessive or controlling. That made them rational. She said that Mrs. Caldwell's decision to bring forward witnesses who would testify to a false narrative, while omitting the critical fact of her ongoing affair, represented a serious lack of judgment and an alarming willingness to manipulate the court system. She said that both children were old enough to have their preferences considered, and she was ordering an immediate in-camera interview with both Mia and Connor to get their unfiltered opinions about custody arrangements. Then she looked at Veronica and said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Caldwell, I strongly suggest you and your attorney reconsider your position on custody arrangements. If these interviews indicate that your children are being subjected to parental alienation, or if I find that you have continued to misrepresent facts to this court, I will not hesitate to order primary custody to Mr. Caldwell. Do you understand?" Veronica nodded, crying openly now. Hutchins requested another recess to discuss options with his client. Judge Holloway granted it and left the bench. I sat there in that courtroom feeling something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Not victory yet. We still had to get through the interviews with the kids, but real, tangible hope that this nightmare might finally be ending. Patricia squeezed my shoulder and told me she needed to step outside to make some calls. I stayed in my seat and let myself breathe for what felt like the first time all day. 20 minutes later, Hutchins approached Patricia in the hallway. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see Patricia's expression go from neutral to satisfied. When she came back to our table, she told me that Veronica was willing to negotiate. The terms they offered were everything I'd been fighting for: joint legal custody with a 60-40 split in my favor, meaning the kids would primarily reside with me. Veronica would have them every other weekend and one evening per week. No child support in either direction since we both made comparable incomes. And most importantly, a clause in the custody agreement that neither parent would introduce a romantic partner to the children without the other parent's advance knowledge and approval. Patricia advised me to take it. She said we could push for more, but that this was a solid outcome that prioritized the kids' stability. I agreed. We signed the agreement that afternoon in a conference room at the courthouse with both attorneys present. Veronica wouldn't look at me during the entire process. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands shook as she signed each page. Part of me felt sorry for her. The larger part remembered her and Bradley discussing how I was too proud to make a scene and felt absolutely nothing. The final hearing where Judge Holloway approved the settlement took less than 15 minutes. She reviewed the terms, asked if we both understood and agreed, and signed the order. Then she looked at both of us and said she hoped we'd both learn something from this process about honesty and integrity. We left the courthouse separately. I went to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not moving, not crying, just letting the weight of the past 6 months finally lift. Then I called Marcus to thank him for his work, Patricia to thank her for her strategy, and finally I called my mother to tell her that her grandchildren would be coming home where they belonged. The aftermath played out over the following weeks in ways both expected and surprising. Bradley Whitmore's wife filed for divorce 3 days after our hearing, citing adultery and attaching the same documentation she'd presented in court. According to mutual connections, Bradley tried to convince her to reconsider, but Jennifer had apparently reached her limit. Last I heard, she'd gotten primary custody of their 3 children and a generous support agreement. Veronica moved out of our house into a 2-bedroom apartment near her office. She attempted to explain things to Mia and Connor during her first weekend visit with them, but they'd already overheard enough adult conversations to know the basic truth. Mia, especially, struggled with feeling betrayed by her mother's lies. We started family counseling, just me and the kids, to help them process everything. My relationship with my children improved dramatically once they were back home full-time. Connor's grades came up, Mia rejoined her soccer team, and the tension that had been present in our house for months finally dissipated. They still saw their mother regularly, but there was a noticeable shift in how they related to both of us. I became the stable parent again, and Veronica became the one they had to visit. As for Veronica and Bradley, their relationship imploded within 2 months of the hearing. Whether it was the pressure of their divorces, the reality of being together without the thrill of sneaking around, or just the fundamental hollowness of a relationship built on deception, they didn't make it. Veronica tried to reconcile with me about 6 months after everything was finalized, showing up at my house one evening claiming she'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to try again. I told her no. Not out of anger anymore, but out of clarity. She'd shown me who she was capable of being when it served her interests, and that person wasn't someone I could trust with my heart, my home, or my children's well-being. The divorce was finalized in March, almost exactly 1 year after I'd found those messages on Mia's iPad. I kept the house. We split our other assets according to our prenuptial agreement, which Veronica had briefly tried to challenge before thinking better of it, and we established a formal custody schedule that we've both adhered to without drama. I've learned a lot from this experience. I've learned that trust, once broken, doesn't repair itself just because someone says they're sorry. I've learned that strategic patience is more powerful than emotional reaction. I've learned that documentation isn't paranoia when you're protecting your future and your children's well-being. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the person you think you know best is actually a stranger wearing a familiar face, and the only thing you can control is how you respond when that mask finally slips. Today, Mia is 13 and Connor is 10. They're doing well, all things considered. We have dinner together every night, we take weekend trips, and we've started building new traditions that are ours alone. They see their mother regularly, and I've encouraged them to maintain that relationship because she's still their parent. Regardless of what happened between us, I haven't started dating again. I'm not ready, and honestly, I'm not sure I trust my judgment anymore. Maybe that'll change. Maybe it won't. For now, I'm focused on being the parent my kids need and rebuilding the life that was nearly destroyed by someone else's choices. And every time I think about that day in court, watching Jennifer Whitmore walk through those doors, and seeing the realization dawn on Veronica's face that her carefully constructed lies were about to collapse, I'm reminded that the truth always has a way of coming out. It just sometimes needs a strategic assist from people who have been burned by the same fire. That's my story. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories of betrayal, strategy, and justice served cold. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, stay calm, document everything, and never underestimate the power of one devastating witness.